The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi everybody, this is Peter Evers, host of Humanity First, and today we have a special treat for everybody. It is now 5 years and a bit since March 2020 when the whole world changed. I was actually speaking to somebody this morning and I was saying, was that before COVID or after COVID? And it seems to be a line of demarcation for everybody now. COVID was an extraordinary thing that is not in our rearview mirror quite yet. But today we're going to have a really great conversation with a social policy expert from Princeton University. His name is Stephen Macedo, and his colleague Francis Lee, who won't be on the call, have written an amazing book which is called "In COVID's Wake: How Our Politics Failed Us." What they're doing here is they're looking at the facts. They are looking at the data. They're looking at analysis of what happened. And America was an amazing place to do that because we were so split in how we should deal with COVID. We'll talk a little bit about that, red states versus blue states. And the question really is, were the decisions that we took at that time, or at least government took, the right decisions? And did that pan out in terms of lives saved, which of course is the thing that was really the focal point of that, versus some of the after effects of COVID relative to, for instance, socioeconomic injustice relative to kids being out of school. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So this is really a wide-ranging conversation that doesn't really look at the politics of what happened, because the politics were important, but were the decisions that were made right at the time, and could they have been different if we'd been able to listen a little bit closer to the American people? We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMSI, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMSI because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse, and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamsijobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Welcome back, everybody. And as promised, we are in for a treat today because we have a very special guest, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Stephen Macedo, who is from Princeton University and a rock star social scientist and political scientist. Welcome to the show. It is wonderful to have you on the show.
I'm delighted to be here.
So this... In my opinion, this is such an important book at this time, both historically in terms of what happened during COVID. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that the book is actually titled In COVID's Wake: How Our Politics Failed Us. And it is a retrospective on what happened and why it happened. And I don't think too many people have asked that question. I was speaking to my mum in England last week, and I was talking about this podcast that we were going to do, and she goes, well, people just didn't know what to do. And that seems to be the pass that we gave our governments from New Zealand to China to Britain to America. But your book uncovers that myth a little bit, doesn't it? That there were many other things that we could have done, and there were many ways to look at what happened. And I guess I would start by saying, was there an action bias with the government at the time? Governments need to do something, right? And do you think that clouded any discussion once a false consensus arrived about what to do?
Yes, I think there's absolutely no question about that. And I guess there's a couple of points I would make. One is that, as you sort of implied just now, there were a whole bunch of pre-COVID pandemic planning documents that warned that these non-pharmaceutical interventions that were imposed, everything before the vaccines and aside from drugs, school closures, business closures, border closures, contact tracing, wearing masks, everything that we're asked to do to socially distance, those plans warned that these measures were not supported by evidence, that there was a weak evidentiary basis for all of them, and that they would be extremely costly. And they said one other thing, which was very prescient, and going back to 2007. It was warned that public officials in the time of a pandemic or a health crisis would have an incentive to use these measures to show they were in charge, to take strong action, to convince the public that they were serious about it. And that was warned about in a 2007 letter from the Institute of Medicine in the United States. The skepticism was expressed about these measures, and the report was emphatic that it's the responsibility of public health officials and leaders to inform the public that there's weak evidence for the effectiveness of these measures, but it was certain that they would be costly and that they needed to be weighed very carefully. So I think there most certainly was an action bias. China initiated this whole process with its very, very severe lockdowns, trying to suppress a respiratory virus, first time that had been attempted in human history. And of course, they had all the tools of an authoritarian state to bring to bear. Right. But then, Italy locked down. Italy had the first national lockdown, and that showed that Western democracy was capable of doing this, that the public would put up with it. And to some degree, the public was clamoring for it because of uncertainty, but also because of not being informed really about the evidence we had about the efficacy of these measures. Right. And then the lockdown spread to neighboring countries, and countries copied one another. And then, of course, it became all the more necessary for leaders to show that they were being just as tough as the other people, or tougher.
Double down, right? Yeah.
Yes, there was a cascade of responses. And, you can look back on some scientists saying in mid-March 2020, hold on here. These measures are unlikely to work. They're going to be costly. People are just following each other off the edge of a cliff because they're not thinking. Yeah. That's a quote from Michael Osterholm, very eminent epidemiologist and public health scholar at the University of Minnesota. But a consensus developed. Yep. Yeah.
What an extraordinary thing to say. The first major public health crisis in 100 years, right? Really, almost the day, right, with Spanish flu, and yet all of those things get in the way of a rational thought process. Now, you would think, and I think we all think this, the government's got it. Okay, we elected them. They're bright, they're smart, they're listening. Actually, they weren't listening, right? And can we touch on, first of all, 87%, I was astonished by this, 87% of Americans at the beginning of this process of lockdown and social distancing were in favor of this. When you think about red state, blue state, and what was done, that is an amazing statistic and underscores, I think, the way in which this sort of false consensus was sold to the American people. Would you agree with that?
Yes. No, not just the American people, but the British people as well. Yeah. We have evidence from documentation there, things that have been released, that the government advisory board was in touch with the BBC to say that young people are not afraid enough. We need to ramp up the messaging because they're being lulled into complacency by the low morbidity rates in their demographic. Yeah. And indeed, the BBC did respond. And we have ample evidence that major journalistic publications in the United States, the news networks, the newspapers, and so on, were very biased in their reporting. They emphasized deaths of young, healthy people, which were extremely rare. Yep. They reported the negative evidence coming out of various early reports. April 8th, the CDC report showed that young people were extremely low risk from COVID, but all the major networks covered only the negative parts of that report, which was that African Americans and men were disproportionately vulnerable, which is true compared to the general population. But they didn't report the striking numbers about children being not vulnerable. And in fact, we had lots of evidence that was come out of Europe. European countries, many of them reopened their schools in April and May. That the evidence from there not being super spreader events from that was not reported in the United States. And as you indicated, democratic states in particular stayed closed very long, generally kept their schools closed in the fall of 2020, while Republican states opened their doors, and European states, for the most part, were open and in business in the late spring, early summer of 2020, and then again in the fall but we didn't pay any attention to the evidence from those. Many schools were open and kids in school, that children were not large spreaders of the virus and were also at very low risk.
Yeah. And, the other thing that I remember it being said at the time was, young people have to socially isolate because they might be spreaders to their older relatives, etc. And I think that was the only thing that was said about that. Yes. It's amazing that there were such bright, brilliant people who were coming forward, and the Great Barrington Declaration that you write about is extraordinary in the book In COVID's Wake. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because what was really worrying to me was how Anthony Fauci's boss was hell bent on destroying the reputation of these people who had incredible credibility, who were saying something different, like it was a morality issue to disagree with what the government was saying. That's really dangerous, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, we think reasonable disagreement about policy matters, about the efficacy of these measures and their costs was moralized very quickly and became very intolerant as early as April 2020 in the United States. But the Great Barrington Declaration, as you say, that was October 2020. Yeah. So much had been learned about the virus by then. They simply repeated the conventional pre-COVID pandemic strategies. Jay Bhattacharya, one of the authors, has said that it's the least original thing he's ever written because they simply repeated the conventional wisdom pre-COVID about pandemics. And they warned that the cost of the lockdown measures, especially the school closures, were very costly, that these would be lifelong detriments to children. And they were especially costly, these measures, to working class people and the less well-off, minority group members who were less able to work, well from home due to, parents being essential workers in many cases. Yeah. And yes, Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, the largest funding agency in the world of health research by far, called them fringe epidemiologists, right. And said there needed to be a quick and devastating takedown in private emails, messages that we now have. Yeah. Yes. So that happened. As you say, there were eminent scholars, Professor Gupta from Oxford, Sunitra Gupta, Martin Kulldorff from Harvard, and Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, all people with very substantial publication records, who were saying the things that everybody said before COVID in a way. It was conventional wisdom. Yeah. And yet they were condemned for it. And we now know that the Biden administration was in touch with social media companies, telling the social media companies to suppress their messaging algorithmically and to boost messaging that supported government policies. That was all secret behind the scenes. Yeah. And we don't know law school conference that has taken place addressing the issue of government suppression of speech during COVID, rather astonishingly.
Isn't that amazing? Now that we know that, and actually Francis Collins, I believe, walked that statement back, a few years later, which is equally interesting to me. Can we just focus on a couple of things there? Vivat Murtry, who was the Surgeon General before COVID, and I think it was afterwards actually when the Biden administration came back, who I have an enormous amount of respect for, made a statement, and we do a lot of work with the elderly in my organization, and he said the biggest killer of the elderly is isolation and loneliness. And he said that before COVID. And it was a call to action, a public health call to action, to build care coordination, to build situations where people can, sort of not be lonely and isolated. Knowing that before COVID, we dove straight into isolating the elderly. My mother-in-law passed during COVID, and we couldn't go to say goodbye to her. That has left an indelible mark on us. That was happening all over the country, and it just seemed like, again, this is the only thing we could do, and we're only interested in saving lives in the now. And yet, again, you refer to this. What are the long-term effects of this? We're not talking about the scars and the gashes that are going to be left in humanity as we come out of this, which, of course, we were going to. That's a really interesting point that you make.
Well, the slogan during COVID was follow the science. But, it was never possible to follow the science when it came to these sorts of policy judgments, like closing nursing homes to visitors. That involves value judgments and complex trade-offs. So we never should have thought that it was simply a scientific question as to whether your mother should have been visited or not. It wasn't. That was just a way of dogmatically brushing aside all concerns and care about that, and to suggest, as you said before, that if you challenge it, you're against the science. We gave too much authority to narrow experts in virology and epidemiology at the expense of all the other values in human life and sources of value in human life that we might have paid attention to. Yeah. Basically, in April 2020, here, the notion was we're at war with COVID. Yeah. We've settled on our strategy, and now everyone needs to get in line. Yeah. And dissent is a kind of disloyalty. So there was a lot of intolerance once a wartime framing was what came to dominate. And we think that took place about as early as April 2020 in the United States. Yeah. We see that in various documents. Yeah. And lots of COVID memoirs written by scientists shortly after the pandemic, reflecting on the first year or so, have war metaphors in the titles. Yeah. That was very unhelpful for questioning whether we really had the right strategy, whether there were other concerns worth taking seriously, such as focusing protection on the elderly. One of the things that was advocated by the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration was that rather than closing down the entire population, we should be focusing protection, our testing capacity, on the elderly. Here in the United States, we tested vast numbers of college students who were among the least vulnerable to COVID, whereas there was very limited testing capacity among nursing home residents, healthcare workers, and those in contact with the elderly and vulnerable.
Yeah, and I want to get back to the essential worker question, but one of the things that struck me in the book was this notion of the government not having faith in the people of the country. And that, I think about Britain as well, because that's where I'm from. And at the same time in England, the same horror was playing itself out. But it was a bit worse then, because the Conservative government at the time under Boris Johnson decided they were going to have their own trysts, parties.
Yes, hypocrites.
Yes. And the hypocrisy of government, I think, undermined that democracy, considering now that the Reform Party, which is the extreme right party, has seen a gap. And I don't directly relate that back to that, but I do think that not trusting people is a real problem when governments decide to go that way. And when you use the war analogy, democracy suffers, right? Because we're doing it it's the big group of people. It's not the individuals, and we lose something there, right?
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. There was a tremendous amount of hypocrisy. Of course, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, had this restaurant dinner which defied his own public health guidelines. Neil Ferguson, who was one of the British scientists who had dire predictions about what would happen if the British government didn't impose these very severe lockdown measures, was found to be having a tryst with his girlfriend, I guess.
Yep, the pictures from the fan above. Everybody remembers.
Oh gosh. Well, and this is true elsewhere as well. Deborah Birx, did a Thanksgiving thing with her relatives that was at odds with the social distance measures. So this was rampant, this hypocrisy. Boris Johnson, of course, there was the famous cocktail party at number 10. So there was a lot of that, and I think you're right. The American Civil Liberties Union in 2008 issued a report at the time of some of these early COVID pandemic plans or virus pandemic plans came out long before COVID, making exactly the points you did, which is that coercive measures tend to spur public distrust, that people don't want to get sick. If you give people good information about viruses, transmissibility, vulnerabilities, and so on, they'll take measures. Instead, as you say, there was a lot of deception that took place. It was denied, for example, in 2020, that getting the virus and recovering would give you immunity. The World Health Organization changed the definition of herd immunity on its website to say it comes from vaccination, whereas previously it said, which is true, it comes from vaccination or getting the virus and recovering. Yeah. They wanted people to wait for the vaccine. Fine. Make that point, make that argument, a good argument. But don't lie to people and lie to people in such blatant terms. So it was, they were caught out on it and they changed it back at December 2020. But that's the kind of thing. They also, by the way, by saying that, they denied people the knowledge that they had immunity if they'd gotten the virus and recovering. And those people could have helped the elderly in nursing homes. Rand Paul, senator from Kentucky, a doctor, he knew that he had immunity after getting the virus very early on. He volunteered in hospitals because he knew he had some immunity. Many people might have done that. Tens of thousands of healthcare workers who got the virus and recovered may have been denied the knowledge that they had immunity. Think about the anxieties they had unnecessarily. And so real harm was done. And there were multiple forms of deception. I mean, we have a whole chapter on noble lies, and I don't say this with any satisfaction, including about the origins of the virus, which is just crazy that that should not be openly debated, since gain-of-function research goes on, and it's extremely dangerous.
It is, and we're coming to the end of our time. But I just wanted to touch on our people here at my organization. The majority of people that work in our organization work in residential homes. We've got 100 of them, and they were extraordinary during COVID. You know, they didn't know what was going on, and they came into work. Some of them came into work for 2 weeks at a time, and then had a week off and came back because they didn't want to be spreaders of the virus. And they were the heroes. And you know, this word "essential worker" was coined. I was in visiting a program 2 days ago, and I was talking about this issue. And one of the workers, who is from the continent of Africa, New American at the time, said it seemed like we were protecting one group of the population, but they didn't really care about us. They cared, and they'd come out on balconies and clap for us and all of those things, but there was no protection for us. I lost a friend who was a direct care worker, and everybody can probably tell a story like that. You know, those are the real heroes during this pandemic, and they deserved, in my opinion, much more honesty and much more truth from their government.
Yes, well, I agree. And certainly healthcare workers during the pandemic were great heroes and great sacrifices and tremendous anxieties and difficulties. There's no question. It was a bad pandemic. It was the worst pandemic in a century. But, you know, there were 1/3 of American workers were essential. Those of us who can do our jobs on our laptops, as you and I are doing at the moment, you know, we're a segment of the population. Frankly, we never could have done the lockdown measures if it wasn't the case that a lot of business and commerce is being done online, which wouldn't have been the case 20 years ago. But 1/3 of people had to keep on working right through the pandemic, and very little special accommodation was made about them, including, you know, the vulnerable members of the essential working class. So we do think that in a way, and this is one thing the great Barrington people said, is that in a way it was a kind of focused protection for the laptop class. We tended to forget the 1/3 of workers that had to prepare our food, deliver our food, process our food, wine, electricity, internet, so on and so forth, firefighters, you know, utility workers and police and so on. And I don't see those people paid 20-30% more because they were essential now as well. I mean, we're still fighting for rates that allow them to, you know, work less than 80 hours a week. And healthcare workers very underpaid.
And that fight goes on. Stephen, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on. And again, I just wanted to give a nod to Francis Lee, your colleague as well, who is wonderful. And again, everybody, I really suggest that you get the book. Will it be coming out on Audible? Somebody asked. Yes,
we are. We just chose a reader, and so we hope that it'll come out in the next few weeks, and a paperback as well. And again, it's Princeton University Press, In COVID's Wake: How Our Politics Failed Us.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate the time.
Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.